Good morning, everyone. We're very pleased that you could participate in this briefing this morning. Those of you here in the audience, parents, professionals, staffers, those of you in webinar land, we are very pleased that you're here as well. I'm Madeline Will. I am Vice President of Public Policy for the National Down Syndrome Society, and I'm also co-founder of the Collaboration to Promote Self-Determination. I want to begin by thanking our speakers and all of our CPSD experts, without whom this briefing would not be possible. I want to thank our CPSD members for their ongoing and solid support. And I want to thank two individuals in particular and single them out. One is Congressman Greg Harper from Mississippi, who provided us with this wonderful opportunity to present to you today. Congressman Harper has been a stalwart supporter and ally and friend of CPSD really from its inception in 2008. He is himself the parent of a young man with disabilities who is in the process of launching himself into adulthood, and therefore Congressman Harper knows full well the roadblocks and the detours that block the path to personal and economic freedom. I also want to thank Congressman Kathy McMorris Rogers, who is also a champion and supporter of CPSD, who has helped facilitate the webinar portion of this briefing. This is a photo of a collage of individuals with disabilities participating in various aspects of life. As I think you know, there has been a tremendous change in the lives of people with disabilities in the past several decades. They are working in the community, enjoying leisure and athletics in the community. They are able to develop relationships, to marry, and these represent a significant transformation in the lives of people with disabilities, and very gratifying for those of us who've been able to watch and to participate to a certain extent. CPSD is an organization of a national disability organization representing now 18 groups that seek to promote opportunities and eliminate barriers to work and savings while ensuring the preservation of long-term supports necessary to achieving independence, self-sufficiency, and economic security. We organizations came together in 2008 because we were wanting to explore the reality for individuals with disabilities, and really to identify whether there were barriers to eliminate with respect to work and savings and independence. And our investigation convinced us that the reality for people with disabilities is deeply flawed. If you look at this chart, you will see that 46 million Americans live in poverty, or were living in poverty in 2010. But if you look at the chart in terms of the subgroups, you will see that disability subcategory is the single largest group in terms of poverty. We also know that people with disabilities experience extremely high unemployment, and that this unemployment rate leads to poverty and dependence, and that this has been a condition that people with disabilities endure and have endured for several decades. It's also the case that, I'm not sure you could read the bottom there, but it's that there are economists who believe that SSI and SSDI will cost a total of $1 trillion by the time we get to 2023. Let's look at another chart now that is illustrative. This is a chart that talks about the expenditures for working age people with disabilities. And as you see, money is not always the problem. Sometimes the problem is an issue of priority. So on this chart, we see a total of $357 billion in fiscal year 2008 expended for working age people with disabilities. We see that 41% of these dollars were spent in income maintenance, and 1%, small, teeny tiny 1% on education, employment, and training. You'll also see in the 55% block for health care that is where long-term services and supports are provided mostly via Medicaid and Medicare. So the question we ask is it possible to utilize long-term service and support dollars better, more effectively, so that we can reduce the amount of dependence that people with disabilities experience? CPSD asks, who benefits from the current system? Not families, not individuals with disabilities, not society. And CPSD asserts that we can do better, we can make improvements through policy change, and that we can enter another period of great transformation in the lives of people with disability in this country. Now, if you look at this last chart, you can see that we have the proof. We know that people with disabilities can work when services are focused on employment. This is a chart that graphs the employment data for 30 states. And you see the great, great disparity in the outcomes. Over in the right-hand corner, my right-hand corner, you see states like Washington State, where there's been a significant increase in the number of individuals with significant disabilities employed. And that is one of the key reasons why we are here and why we want to discuss with you the reality of change that is taking place in states across the country and which needs to take place at the federal level as well. I now am going to turn the dais over to a distinguished colleague. He is Ari Neiman, who is the founder and president of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and he is going to talk about the systemic and very stubborn barriers that an individual faces in our society and current system of services and supports. Ari?
Let me say it's always an honor and a challenge to follow Madeline Will, who's been doing this work for longer than I've been alive. But I shall endeavor to do so. Over the course of the last century, we have seen a tremendous sea change in how people with disabilities are viewed by our society and by our government. In the early part of the 20th century, the thought with regards to disability was that this was primarily a public health phenomena and that the main goal of government with respect to disability should be to remove said individuals from the general population, both for their own protection and for the protection of society. This is how our structure of institutionalization emerged, growing larger and larger in the first half of the 20th century until at one point 3 in every 1,000 Americans were in an institution. But at a certain point, we saw a fairly significant sea change. And with the deinstitutionalization movement, with the disability rights movement, and with more modern movements like Employment First, we started to look as a society and recognize that the goals of people with disabilities are the same as the goals of the general population. The ADA states that the goals of the nation with regards to disability should be equality of opportunity, full participation, economic self-sufficiency, and independent living. These are the same things that any member of the general population aspires to. Our challenge is that today we have 21st century expectations for people with disabilities while still suffering through a service provision system that is stuck in a set of expectations that are holdovers from that earlier part of the 20th century, when the working assumption was, if you are disabled, you belong in an institution, you do not belong in the workforce, and you do not aspire to or have the right to aspire to the same kinds of social inclusion and economic advancement of any other American. There are a great many areas in which our service provision system reflects these challenges, leading to the outcomes of which Madeline made reference to. Some of the most common include the fact that SSI beneficiaries have a resource limit of $2,000, a figure that is not adjusted for inflation and has remained constant since 1989. Now, many individuals with disabilities, in fact, the research suggests that this is a sizable percentage of the population that applies for benefits, go on SSI not because of a pressing desire to leave the workforce, but because in order to access the long-term services and supports and health care that people with disabilities need, they need access to public health insurance. And SSI is a gateway to the Medicaid program. And so our current disability policy system operates on the assumption that people with disabilities will leave the workforce, and thus creates a system in which the only way in which people can access the services and supports that they require is to take that route. It's something we need to keep in mind when we start talking about programs like SSDI and SSI. These are by and large not programs full of beneficiaries who want to work the system, but they're also not necessarily programs that are exclusively populated by people who could not participate in the workforce. They're programs that a great percentage of applicants are accessing because they're the only way to access public health insurance and long-term services and supports that will enable this population to live in the community and be integrated into the broader society. So if we want to address that large percentage of the pie that Madeline made reference to that is going to income maintenance, if we want to be looking at how we reduce those costs and afford an opportunity to shift funding into healthcare, services and supports, and also broader causes that relate to other parts of the federal budget, we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we empower people who want to work and who don't want to be going on these income support programs to enter the workforce and nonetheless have access to the health care and long-term services and supports that they need? We're seeing a couple of very interesting transitions over the course of the next coming years. And in my capacity with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and also as a member of the National Council on Disability, I've had the opportunity to talk with a number of individuals both on the ground who depend on these programs and who are playing a role in implementing some of the coming changes to these programs in recent years. Between 1960 and 2010, over 200 institutions for people with developmental disabilities were closed. We've seen a tremendous amount of progress in the deinstitutionalization movement. We now have 13 states with no large state-run institutions, a smaller number of states with no institutions altogether. But now we're starting to think about how do we take it a step beyond that? How do we move from thinking on deinstitutionalization that just says we're going to move people from large settings to small settings to thinking on deinstitutionalization that says a smaller setting is essential, but it's not sufficient. And to an increasing degree, we're looking at a transition that involves separating out the act of providing housing with the act of providing services and supports for people with developmental disabilities. And this becomes very important because if you are a person with a disability and you are living in a provider-owned group home or a provider-owned apartment, and you want to fire your provider, you're not happy with the quality of service that is being offered to you, and you want to make use of market competition and reach out and find someone else, you run into severe difficulties. You have to move if you're living in provider-owned housing. So by opening up more opportunities to try and shift service provision away from real estate, not only do we enhance competition on the part of providers and improve the opportunities that are available for people with disabilities, but we also see some significant changes in cost because we're no longer figuring into the costs we're paying providers upkeep for housing and similar types of things. We see a similar transition when we look at our service provision system around employment. At one point, the working assumption was that people with developmental disabilities wouldn't be participating in the workforce altogether, and so rehabilitation settings were set up. Then the working assumption was people with developmental disabilities could participate in the workforce, but they could only do so if they were in segregated sheltered workshops that paid less than minimum wage. Now, thanks to the Employment First movement, we're moving away from sheltered workshops too. We're recognizing them as part of the obsolete legacy infrastructure that we have an obligation to do away with as we did away with institutionalization. In 2003, Vermont became the first state to close its last sheltered workshop and provide employment services entirely within integrated settings. Today, that state has double the national average of integrated employment. We're seeing other states follow its example, led by some of the work of the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Programs is doing to drive a greater degree of technical assistance to state government and offer opportunities that go beyond simply segregating people in sheltered workshop settings. But all of this, just to sum up, all of this is part of a broader process of shifting expectations. At one point, when we talked about disability, our national imagination was very small. It was primarily through a prism of medical care. We thought, these are people, my population, are people who cannot contribute to society, who cannot offer anything, and thus the only thing that can be done is to place us aside until such a time as people pass on and such individuals are no longer born in this world. That outlook has fundamentally changed over the course of the last 100 years, the last 50 years, the last 30 years, and even in the last 23 years since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so because of that, we need to change our service provision system in the way that Madeline spoke about, in the way that our panelists are going to speak about, and in the way that we're going to talk to you here about today, to ensure that we are reflecting a service provision system that has 21st century expectations for people with disabilities. With that, I want to introduce one of our first panelists who has dedicated her work to advancing that cause in a most significant way. Laura Owens, Executive Director of the Association for the Promotion of Supported Employment. Thank you very much.
Push the button, that's right. I was going to be his job coach, so.
We were briefed on how to turn on the microphones.
Thank you very much, Ari. It's also very difficult to follow Ari with his so eloquent talk about integrated employment and integrated housing. I'm the Executive Director of National APSE, which is now the Association of People Supporting Employment First, and I would just like to quickly introduce David Hoff, our Board President, who's also in the audience as well. Just quickly, what is APSE? APSE is a national organization, and our primary focus is on integrated employment for individuals with disabilities. We are a membership organization with about 3,000 members, and this year is our 25th anniversary, so we're quite proud that we've made it this long, focusing and fighting really hard for the rights of people with disabilities. The first thing I want to talk about is what do we mean by employment? And I always tell people that if we have to ask the question, what is employment? Is this employment? Then it probably isn't employment. Really what we're talking about when we talk about employment for individuals with disabilities is the same type of employment that we talk about for the rest of us. Typical employment on the payroll of a business, not a service provider. No special jobs for people with disabilities. Earning minimum wage, earning the same benefits as other employees doing the same types of jobs, and being fully integrated in the workforce, working alongside non-disabled coworkers, interacting with individuals without disabilities as customers. For background, real quickly, Ari kind of went through this, but the background of people with disabilities is that people with disabilities do oftentimes need some type of assistance, and really what we're talking about today with Employment First is changing the service delivery structure that we have. In the past, we have had options because our belief was that individuals with disabilities were not able, they were not capable, and that's what disability meant. And we know now that people with disabilities are very capable, and they have lots of skills and abilities to offer our communities and our businesses. And quite honestly, we need all people to be working in our communities for our businesses to prosper and our communities to thrive. Typically, services have been funded by Medicaid, rehabilitation services, mental health block grants, and oftentimes are supplemented through state and county funds. And these options were developed because we really wanted to figure out how people could participate in the communities. And we know from the past that people being viewed as not capable is not an option any longer. So we do have a changing landscape. People with disabilities are capable. We know that. Not only am I the executive director of a national organization, but I also have an employment agency for people with disabilities in Wisconsin, and we've been around for 23 years helping people with disabilities find jobs. And so we know over the past 30 years that people with disabilities are capable, they can work in the community, they can participate in our communities. And we also know that employment is a better option than segregation, that people with disabilities can work side by side along with their non-disabled coworkers. They can participate in community and they can be part of our society. And that we also know that policies are changing, and as a result, state and federal agencies are increasingly recognizing that among the available service options, employment has to be the priority. It shouldn't be, can somebody work? It should be, somebody can work. Employment First is the general theme. Employment in the community is the first and primary service option for individuals with disabilities. Pretty simple. And then APSE's statement on Employment First is that employment in the general workforce is the first and preferred outcome in the provision of publicly funded services for all working age citizens with disabilities, regardless of the level of their disability. We're very excited because there are about 35 states now that have some type of Employment First movement. About 2/3 of the efforts of Employment First have some sort of policy statement, legislatively based. About a 1/3 or more grassroots, where people are out there within their organizations or within their communities working on influencing state policies or local policies. And about 23 states have official Employment First policies or legislation. And these are the states that have policies that I'm not going to read for you because you can read that. 8 have passed legislation, and I will point those out: California, Delaware, Kansas, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Utah, and Washington State. The remainder are executive orders or policy directives from the state. And what's kind of important to point out is Employment First really is cross-disability, but 9 states focus on intellectual and developmental disabilities. Employment really has to be the first option for best practice, and it really is about changing our policy structures so that our policy structures can move forward what we know is best practice, which is people with disabilities being part of their communities, being part of the business community. So a major focus of Employment First has to be on looking at where our resources are currently being provided and shifting those resources to where we want it to be, which is helping people with disabilities access community employment. A vast majority of public resources currently are still being used for segregated non-employment services, which Ari pointed out. So the role of federal government and Employment First, we know that it can be done statewide, we know that it can be done locally, is really to kind of look at continuing and expanding the CMS efforts to prioritize employment, integrated employment for individuals with disabilities, to really strengthen the Rehabilitation Act so that VR is really looking at focusing their resources on integrated employment in the general workforce. We feel really strongly, and you'll hear in a little bit about the TEAM Act, but really looking at IDEA, looking at transition from school to adult life, and that we should be preparing young adults with disabilities to be working in the community, not to be segregated once they graduate high school. To continue the Department of Justice efforts to push states to increase community employment by looking at the Olmstead Act, and then to expand access for people with disabilities to have more access to the public workforce. We also need to take a look at Social Security, because one of the disincentives that we hear is that people are afraid to go and work in the community and earn a living wage. So we need to sort of look at and maintain and expand the incentives that Social Security already has. So looking at the SSI asset limit, which we'll also be talking about the ABLE Act a little later as well, but kind of re-looking at that, strengthening the ticket to work. Because right now, Social Security and work, there's sort of a mixed message. You have to demonstrate that you have a disability in order to get Social Security, and yet then we turn around and say, but now we want you to work, and we want you to use these work incentives to get off the rolls. So it's kind of a mixed message for people. So we want to kind of take a look at that as well. So the bottom line for us is that we are undergoing major cultural shift from viewing people with disabilities as incapable of working in the community and participating in their communities, to viewing them as full participants in the workforce and the economic mainstream. And it's not only better for people with disabilities, it's also better for communities and society and for taxpayers. So now Rob Samira will talk a little bit more about taxpayer issues.
Thanks, Laura. Before I begin, I just want to make a few things clear. One is that I'm a researcher. Okay? I don't have any political organizations. I'm not a member of any disability groups or any professional organizations. I don't go to faculty meetings. Basically, my job is to give policymakers the information they need to make informed decisions. I don't care what those decisions are, okay? My job is so that you have information that you can make intelligent, well-informed decisions based upon disability focus groups. I've worked with shelter workshops, I've worked with supported employment. I have no preferences whatsoever other than what my wife tells me to do. So that's all that I'm kind of concerned about. So my research, again, is just as the data. You can all draw your conclusions. When we're looking at the cost of supported employment versus, say, sheltered workshops, You can look at it a number of different ways. One is the cumulative cost. That is the moment that they begin the program to the moment they end the program. Another way is to look at the cost per hour worked. So the number of hours that someone's in a shelter workshop versus the number of hours that somebody is getting a job, or that's working in the community. The other one is cost per dollars earned. In each circumstance, individuals in supported employment are more cost effective than people in shelter workshops. So again, I have an article out on the table that summarizes all the literature in supported employment. If you need anything off that, just let me know. But again, this is the data. That's all I'm saying. When you look at the cost effectiveness to taxpayers, okay, the return on investment, supported employment returns about $1.21 for every dollar that is invested in it. So for every dollar that's of cost being what's going into the program, you get $1.21 back in the form of taxes paid, reductions in government subsidies from supported employees, and the reduction of costs that alternative programs would cost. So there's a return on investment for the taxpayers. From the workers' perspective, for every dollar that they give up in terms of wages that they could have earned in a sheltered workshop versus wages in the community, or the losses as a result of working community to their government subsidies, for every dollar that they lose, they gain over $4 back. And that's regardless of disability, number of disabilities, and other demographics. Basically, everybody that works in the community gets more money than they would have had they not worked in the community. And again, that's regardless of disability. Another interesting finding that might be of interest to some of you is, how can I say this? The use of shelter workshops in the transition continuum. There are some people that will say that people that exit high school should go into shelter workshops and then go into the community. And one of the things that some of you have asked me to look at is whether that makes an impact. The idea is that if somebody goes into a shelter workshop, that they should learn some sort of skills as a result of being in a shelter workshop. Therefore, they should do better than somebody that has never been in a shelter workshop. That is, the question is, are shelter workshops value added? Do they teach you something that allows the person to become more employed, better employed, and so forth? What I found was when you compared people that were supported employees that were in shelter workshops previously to support employees that were not in shelter workshops, the individuals who are not in shelter workshops receive services that are far less than those who had been in shelter workshops. The theory is, and again, it's just a theory, that when people go to shelter workshops, they learn skills, but they're not the skills that you need to know in order to be competitively employed. For example, you go into a workshop and you're told where to hang your coat, or you're told what to do, you're told all these things, and it's very dependent based. You're told on how to act and what to do at any given time. That's not what employers want in their employees in the community. So when you send somebody to a sheltered workshop first and then into the community, they need more services and therefore more cost to taxpayers than they would if they just left high school and went directly to the community. And they also earn more money. But again, those are things that we need to work on in terms of support employment, that they still earn poverty wages. I'm sorry? Okay, time? I think so. Is it on now? Do you want me to repeat all of that? Because I don't know if I could. The joke went over really well at first. I don't know if they'll laugh the second time around. Summary, employment is good. Thank you very much. Again, if any of you, my job is to help educate or provide you with information. So those of you who are policymakers, if you have questions, just email me and let me know. And if you have $1 million grant, that would be nice too. But that's my job. So my job is to answer questions. If you have any questions regarding employment, I would love to work with you. The mic is now on.
Now I'd like to introduce Rich Luking.
Good morning, everyone. As several other people have stated about the honor of being here following these distinguished folks, Curtis and I continue to have that honor because what you just heard is so important, and those folks, Laura and Rob, are doing things that inform us and drive us in directions that we should be considering.
Okay.
So my name is Rich Luking. I'm president of a nonprofit organization called Transcend Incorporated. Transcend is dedicated, our mission is to improve employment success of people with disabilities. We've been at this for about the last 25 years, and among the things we do is to demonstrate ways in which individuals with disabilities can achieve integrated employment. And then we also research what works in those demonstrations. So what I'm going to give you this morning is a summary of some of what we've learned over the course of that time that relates to the TEAM Act, and Curtis Richards will provide a little bit more detail about what the TEAM Act is and what it hopefully will lead us into a direction that might bring some of the outcomes that we've researched and know that work. So a couple of important points to start out with. Here's what we know by the demonstrations that we have done and the researches that we have done and the work of folks in the field and researchers around the country can basically be summarized by these things. That all youth currently in special education with support and opportunity can work. In other words, we should presume that everyone, regardless of their disability, can and should work. We should presume that people should not only have any job, but a job of their choice, and not just a job of their choice, but a job where they're contributing in specific ways to the operation of the employers who hire them. And so the concept of presumed employability is important in terms of policy because we're learning more and more that not only is it possible, but that folks with disabilities who are in special education and their families are wanting that. And so in many respects, the idea is that the folks who drive this should be the folks who are receiving the services. In other words, their choices should be determined by them, and that should drive the things that the educators and the rehabilitation professionals and others do with them and on their behalf. So we know, and Laura Owens previously pointed out the fact, and Rob Samara's research confirms that not only can folks work, but it's beneficial to everybody if they do. So one could then argue that the culmination of special education services for youth in this country in special education should be and can be, and there's no reason why it cannot be, work. All of the public investment in education for these young people certainly would be put to good use if the result is, at the end of the educational experience, to be employed adults. And so what we've also known and learned is that those youth who have been and are currently in special education, who have work experiences and paid jobs as part of that education or as adjuncts to that education, are way more likely to be employed as adults than those youth who do not have those opportunities. So one might presume from that and conclude that our education system would be well served, and the young people would be well served, and the families would be well served, and the taxpayers would be well served if work is part of their educational experience. We also know, and this is what's important for us to be talking about today and really sets the stage for the importance of the TEAM Act, is that many youth are going to need ongoing support after they leave school, if they're working when they're in school, to maintain that work. And so we've been able to demonstrate how that works and what it takes. So first of all, we know that if schools and the educators who work in those schools and the families who support the youth and the youth themselves all believe that work is possible, then it's likely to happen. If the services that the youth receive as adults as they're transitioning from school also believe that, in other words, the vocational rehabilitation system, the developmental disabilities services system, and the vendors who are paid through those systems also believe that, then you can expect some collaboration to occur that will make that seamless transition from being a student to an adult employed person. And that if they work together, that employment happens before they exit school. In other words, wouldn't it be great if at the end of the educational experience, the youth already has a job that they can keep as they exit school and become an adult. That the early linkages between the school systems and those organizations that would support their employment after they leave school are working together before the student leaves school, then we've learned through our demonstrations and our research that definitely work is not only possible, not only likely, but almost guaranteed under those circumstances. So the focus of the service then, as Laura Owens so eloquently pointed out, should be integrated employment. In other words, we should be thinking, and can be thinking, and we've proven that it's possible to think, that every youth, regardless of the degree of support they might need to find and keep a job, can work, and that integrated employment can be the result. And as Rob Samare pointed out, the costs are much less. Now, they're especially less if that search for employment and experience in a job and actual holding a job happens before they leave school. What better way to invest public money than through that? So the result for youth who do experience that and who do have work in high school, in their secondary school years, and who are beneficiaries of school systems and adult agencies and families and so forth all working together, is a seamless transition. In other words, the ideal, the gold standard, so to speak, is that youth, the day after they leave school is no different than the day before. In other words, they have a job, they have the supports in place to keep in that job and advance in their career in that job or other jobs, so that seamless transition occurs. So the point of all that is that, again, we know it's possible. We've proven that it can work, and we have data that shows that when students experience that kind of progression, they achieve much higher rates of employment, which are certainly way higher than the current norm that Madeline Will pointed out earlier and Ari Neiman talked about. So the TEAM Act, which Curtis will describe and talk about, the implications of that are big, because what I just described is not the norm, it's what's possible. And what that represents is that if we know it can work, and if we know that youth can have jobs that they choose and that benefit the employers who hire them, and we know that it costs less, why aren't we doing more of it? It's because the systems in place now don't encourage that. We're, as I think Ari mentioned, we're still kind of operating in 20th century systems. And so how do we bring those systems in line so that we're operating in a more contemporary mode? Well, the TEAM Act, I think, is one way to make that happen. So as I'm turning this over to Curtis, who will explain more about that and what the TEAM Act might do, just a couple of slides here, a slide here that talks about resources. Much of what I described or talked about in two places that you can access to learn more, and that's up on the screen and for your benefit. So I'll turn it over to Curtis, who will talk how the TEAM Act might make things happen that reflect what I just described.
Thank you. I'm Curtis Richards with the Institute for Educational Leadership here in Washington, D.C., and we, for the last 12 years, have been fortunate enough to be funded by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, which has helped create a lot of the work, the research work, the synthesis work, upon which much of my comments are going to be based. We also are a member of CPSD, and actively participating in the Education and Transition Task Force of CPSD. I want to build a little bit on what Rich has said by saying that we have no agreement in this country about what transition is. We have a whole lot of activities going on. We have had a whole lot of activities going on for some time. We have community-based organizations around the country doing this piece or that piece, or a few pieces and a few pieces here, but we have no agreement. In public policy, we have no agreement. If you look at what's in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that is the special ed law, what you have is goals around what transition ought to look like. You have outcomes that we want to see, that is moving young people towards community living and employment and more education, et cetera. And you have a whole lot of due process issues in between, and you have some planning documents that you're supposed to work through, and now we have a few accountability outcomes that schools and states and systems are being held to around indicators 13 and indicators 14 for post-school outcomes and for transition outcomes. But you have nothing that talks about what transition really ought to be. If you look at what's in the what's in the Workforce Investment Act, Title I, which governs the employment and training programs for youth services in this country, you have no reference to the word transition at all. You have a set of issues that are supposed to be occurring within local jurisdictions around employment and training. You have age issues of younger youth and older youth, 14 to 17, 18 to 24, and no connectedness to transition. If you look at what's then in Title IV of the Workforce Investment Act, that being the Vocational Rehab Act, you have references to, in one of the 19 set of services that Voc Rehab is supposed to pay for is something called transition services. But you don't have any real definition about what that is. You have some issues built into the statute that says the rehab agencies are supposed to work with the departments of education and the school districts, and yet if you look at the way counselors are awarded, what it is that they're counted on or held accountable for, it's about getting an employment outcome, and you don't necessarily get an employment outcome quickly if you're working with a young person who's still in school trying to figure out how to transition toward employment. And you have no age issues in the Rehab Act about what it is, when it is, even though a lot of people believe that there are some age restrictions about when Voc Rehab can be working in transition. There are not. In rehab, you're supposed to be working with, the counselors are supposed to be working with young people in schools as soon as possible. In IDEA, the age restriction is now, says that you do the planning no later than, you know, the young person's 16th birthday. So we've got you know, policies that just don't connect in statute. You open that and go even further into foster care legislation or juvenile justice legislation or community service legislation, and it gets even more murky. What the TEAM Act itself is about modernizing this disability public policy and doing so in a way that really tries to align just some clear definitions. We've got conflicting definitions in all these various statutes. And so in the two and a half, 3 years of trying to create the content, what I call the content of transition, you know, the CPSD crowd, you know, sat down and figured out what makes sense and what it is that we can try to align amongst these different statutes. So coming up with definitions about even what integrated employment is, which is referred to in the Voc Rehab statute, but not necessarily in the WIA Title I statute or in the IDEA. So, you know, some serious common definitions across these various pieces of legislation. Blending and braiding funding, because we know there's a lot of resources out there, and we know that there's still more resources that are needed. But, you know, agencies need to be given permission to blend and braid resources, and that's sort of a key piece of what is here. In the education package, I mean, I like to talk about these as a package because there's a bunch that deal with a bunch of issues that deal with the education issues in special ed. There's a bunch that deal with the Voc Rehab sections, and then there's some that now are putting with one of the bills that is really bringing the developmental disabilities agencies into this conversation in a big way, creating divisions that are going to focus on transition inside these developmental disability agencies, having folks inside those agencies responsible for developing transition plans themselves for the folks with significant disabilities that they're working with, aligning with bringing the DD agencies into the school planning process around the IEPs. In the IEPs, we're really now putting language in, we would be putting language in the statute that talks about some of the content issues that need to occur around transition, because we know there's a whole set of things around education that needs to occur, a whole set of things around the career preparation, that is job shadowing, site visits, internships, those sorts of things, community service, those sorts of things. There's a whole set of things around youth development and youth leadership issues, that is helping work through the age and stage appropriate conflict resolution issues, self-esteem issues, self-determination issues, self-advocacy issues. All of this stuff is kind of woven now into this package of bills, so that we're for the first time, from a public policy standpoint, really addressing, as Rich, and Rob and folks have told you, what it is we've learned. We're now in statute saying this is what we're expecting you to put your energy into as we move forward. There also are the age issue in IDEA, for example, is also addressed in the education bill, so that we're dropping the age back down to 14 as it ought to be. Anybody who's done any research in this arena knows that transition planning really needs to begin a lot earlier than 14, but for purposes of eligibility, so we're dropping back the age to 14 in IDEA. We are also putting some language in that would authorize, this is a pretty important piece, that would authorize some of the discretionary funds, the special ed discretionary funds that states and schools get, to be able to bring in from the outside community-based organizations that are accustomed to working with folks with disabilities and folks with significant disabilities, to help do the planning and help coordinate some of the services that folks need. Other language that gets put into the IDEA focuses on authorizing using funds to help get young people into customized employment issues, and being able to move young people, use their IEP to move young people into integrated competitive employment, as opposed to the sheltered workshop issues that Laura and Ari were both talking about. In the rehab legislation, in the employment legislation, there's also a whole big emphasis on improving the coordination and again the definitional issues that are in there. And making sure that counselors are helping move people, moving young people into integrated competitive employment. So aligning those issues across both of the IDEA and the VOC rehab statutes. And then there's also, as I said, there, while there is a lot of money here, there's also some other money needed. And so there is in this package of bills authorization and to put in some funding to be able to have coordinators, transition coordinators in schools working with this population, and some demonstration projects. And I guess I just want to close by saying, for folks, I haven't quite been at this for 25 years like Rich, although I feel like it now after the last 12 years. But it's really nice to see new leadership in the Congress that has stepped in and introduced himself as a snotty-nosed Republican who couldn't even find his way to the restroom from his office, who said, I want to do this and I want to do it now, and is determined to try to push this stuff forward. Because as a parent, he clearly recognizes what we all need to understand, and it's what I think the TEAM Act package is about, which is no one person can do this work alone anymore. No one system can do this work alone. No one organization. It really does take a whole lot of coordination across systems and across agencies. And if we don't align our statutes to be able to do that, we're going to continue to have this helter-skelter approach to what we do around transition.
And now Sarah Weir and Michael Morris.
Good morning. My name is Michael Morris, and I am the founder and director of the National Disability Institute. Created the organization 8 years ago. You can think about it as a kind of think tank that's very action-oriented. We work on policy research, education and training, demonstration projects. We work with government at all levels, financial institutions, the business community, and community groups within and outside the support system for people with disabilities. I created the organization because I felt there was a need for a very different kind of discussion. You've heard today a discussion about employment. That is at the core of the discussion that started National Disability Institute. But we wanted to go further, and we wanted to really look at issues around economic advancement and economic stability. I'm going to share with you some statistics as why this is particularly relevant to individuals with disabilities and families with a member with a disability, but also, and first and foremost, most important, why is it relevant to you? 1 in 5 families in this country now has a member with a disability, cutting across the full spectrum of disability. If you happen to be here representing a district in the South, the statistics are even greater than that, greater than 1 in 5. Disability is often very much aligned with poverty in terms of poverty begets disability. And as a result, there's greater poverty in the southern states, and as a result, it's even more relevant to you. Disability cuts across gender, race, ethnicity, and obviously geography. So it's important to you, and it's important to all of us. You saw in some of the earlier slides the costs of disability. In a government that is struggling to bring down the deficit, it is more than urgent time to rethink this conversation about costs, about return on investment, and most importantly, about supporting individuals with disabilities and families in much the way that the Americans with Disabilities Act talked about some 23 years ago, not only to end discrimination, but also to look about aligning public policy to meet public responsibility related to community living, employment, and the advancement of economic self-sufficiency. You saw a slide a little while ago on the screen that talked about that people with disabilities who are recipients of SSI, Supplemental Security Income, are limited in what resources they can hold on to just $2,000. I want you to think for just a moment what your life would be like, what your family's life would be like, what anyone you know, neighbors, friends, what would your life be like if you had no incentive to save and, in fact, to get access to a basic social safety net of public benefits? You have to accept a life sentence of poverty. It's unfair, it's disappointing, it's distressing, it's disillusioning. None of us could live with that life bargain. It is no bargain at all. We know now what researchers are beginning to study in terms of the extra costs of raising a child with a disability and the extra costs of living as an adult a life with disability. What we know now from the research that's beginning to come out is that 91% of families raising a child with a disability has extra stress and financial burden beyond what the costs are for raising a child without disability. We know from the research today that the cost of raising a child into adulthood with significant disabilities are easily 2 or 3 times the cost. And yet our public policy is not aligned in any way to absorb that critical factor that rips families apart, that creates financial instability and insecurity. We know the extra costs, what they're about. There are extra costs of health care. There are extra costs of personal assistance to help for many to get up in the morning, to bathe, to get dressed, to help with eating. We know it's related to technology assistance. We know for others it's related to transportation, and for others it may relate to home modifications. And for an individual with multiple disabilities, it may relate to all of those extra costs. What we haven't done, and what the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, did not do, is try to figure out some new equation, some new calculation that brings into play how, for families who are spending more, how can we balance the sense of public policy and public responsibility to help those families and help adults with disabilities. Today, as you heard from the prior speakers, it's about modernization of policy. It's about a better return on investment of billions of dollars, not millions, but billions of dollars in public funding across funding streams: education, Medicaid and health care, labor and employment, vocational rehabilitation. It's about rethinking a set of expectations that people with disabilities do want to work, they do want to save, they do want greater financial stability and greater opportunity to travel a path to greater financial self-sufficiency. You're going to hear from Sarah about another piece of legislation. For many of you, it should not be new. It has been brought up in this Congress, in the prior Congress, in the Congress before that, and the Congress before that. What's fascinating about this piece of legislation is it deals with these extra cost issues and doesn't say, government, it's your total responsibility to bail out all families. It says something completely different. Give families a chance. Give families an opportunity with a tax-saving vehicle, a different approach modeled after what you'll hear about with the 529 funds for families, putting money aside for the education of their children, to be able to have this mechanism to do things to deal with the extra costs of a different quality of life for individuals with disabilities. That life sentence of poverty would go away. The expectation that people could save would be met. The opportunity to work and not be afraid of losing eligibility for health care, for rental assistance, for supplemental security income, it would be a game changer. It would be transformative. So what we have is something that is common sense, and in this Congress, like the previous Congresses, this wasn't a Republican bill, this wasn't a Democratic bill. This wasn't a bill from a block of members of the Congress from one region of the country. This was something people got because families came out and told their personal stories. It is something that needs to happen with urgency. At this time, as government is cutting back in expenditures due to the federal deficit, and that grand deal is still yet to be made. But what we do know is states are cutting back in their costs of trying to provide that basic social safety net to help families and help individuals with disabilities. The ABLE Act is about a shared sense of responsibility, and I hope I've gotten your attention, and Sarah will share with you what are the key elements of the legislation.
Great, thanks, Michael. I'm Sarah Weir. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy for the National Down Syndrome Society. I work with Madeline Will and Allison Wool through their leadership with the collaboration to promote self-determination. I'm excited to talk about the ABLE Act very briefly. This morning, we look at this as just another planning tool for our families and for our self-advocates. I just want to recognize we have Jennifer from Congressman Crenshaw's office. He has been the congressional champion behind this legislation for the last 7 years. As Michael pointed out, this is the 4th Congress that we've introduced this legislation. And of course, Scott Mulvaney from Congressman Harper's office has been a key champion for this legislation as well. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on the ABLE Act legislation. We've been working with a coalition of national disability organizations, nonprofits, other organizations, other stakeholders on this legislation, all the members of CPSD, Autism Speaks, and other organizations have been instrumental in building and generating the support we have for this legislation. From NDSS's perspective, this is our #1 legislative priority for several reasons, but really because it's cross-disability. Michael did a fantastic job of describing the rationale for this legislation and the need, and we feel, most importantly, that this legislation can pass in this particular Congress. So the ABLE Act would really help people with disabilities maintain health, independence, and have a better quality of life. The legislation is really intended to supplement, not supplant, benefits through private insurance, Medicaid, the Medicaid program, the Supplemental Security Income Program, and the beneficiary's employment and other resources. Just a little bit of additional background. The ABLE Act is under the auspices of the 529 program. This is actually the first time we've introduced the ABLE Act under the 529 program. It's the exact same legislation that was introduced in the 112th program. Really, the goals of the 529 program, the College Savings Program, are the same for the ABLE program, or for the ABLE Act and ABLE account, so it made a lot of sense to include it under this particular program. Obviously, Michael did a fantastic job of pointing out the purpose of the program, or purpose of the ABLE Act, so I won't go into too much detail about that. I just want to point out a couple key features of the bill. It's under the 529 program. It establishes additional disability qualified expenses, things like education, housing, transportation, employment support, health-related resources. We always give the example when we're up on the Hill talking about the need for the ABLE Act that the Medicaid program doesn't cover all the necessary health benefits of an individual. For example, the California program doesn't cover dental services for our folks. And just because you have Down syndrome or autism or another disability doesn't mean you don't need to get your teeth cleaned twice a year like the ADA recommends. Assistive technology and personal support, and then we've left another category around miscellaneous expenses that are important for the ABLE account. And most importantly, as Michael pointed out, it protects the eligibility for federal programs such as SSI and Medicaid. The qualification for an ABLE account is tied to receiving supplemental security income benefits or disability benefits under Title II of the Social Security Act, or we've also built in a provision that would allow a doctor's note to also help you qualify for an ABLE account. As I pointed out, it will follow all the requirements of the current 529 program. All the infrastructure that is intact for the 529 will apply to this ABLE legislation. I went through the disability qualified expenses. These are very important because a lot of times Medicaid and Social Security won't cover the necessary benefits or costs for a lot of the expenses listed here. Just a couple of key provisions that I want to point out. As I mentioned, this is the first time we've introduced the same legislation in the 113th Congress. Two important provisions. Federal treatment of the ABLE account under the Supplemental Social Security Income Program. What I call is a $100,000 threshold. When the account reaches $100,000 in assets, the individual or the beneficiary doesn't disqualify you from receiving SSI. Your check is just suspended. And that was something we thought from our coalition's perspective in working with our congressional leaders on the Hill, that this was a pretty equity fairness issue, having $100,000 and suspending that check until you spend it down, or if you want to spend your account up, it's up to the individual family, and the individual was a pretty fair provision in that legislation. The other key provision is that the legislation includes a Medicaid payback. So when the individual passes away, if you can't roll the account over to an immediate sibling in the family that may have a disability, the funds left over in that account go back to reimburse the state Medicaid program for services used at the time of when you open up an ABLE account. We really feel like these are two key provisions to allow our families and individuals to acquire assets and use one of these accounts for those daily expenses. Just a little bit of background on the congressional landscape, as Michael pointed out. There is a lot of bipartisan, bicameral support. As of this morning, I double-checked, we have 29 co-sponsors in the Senate, 128 co-sponsors in the House, and that continues to grow. I think we had 700 disability advocates on the Hill yesterday advocating for this legislation. We've had 50 national organizations endorse the ABLE Act, and we continue to move forward, working with our congressional leaders, with Congressman Crenshaw and Senator Burr and Senator Casey on the Senate side. We really have a multifaceted legislative strategy to get this legislation passed. We're pursuing other legislative vehicles, but we're also continuing to generate as much support for the legislation. I think.
Hi, good morning. My name is Allison Wool, and I am thrilled to be the executive director of CPSD, a group that was started several years ago by the National Down Syndrome Society, the National Fragile X Foundation, and the Autism Society of America. And I see so many people in this room who've worked tirelessly for so long. I want to recognize Tom Nerney from the Center for Self-Determination, who's come down from Rhode Island this morning. We have Alan Bergman, who's here from Chicago, friends from ODEP, from HUD. You know, it's really heartening to see the work that's happening around these issues. When I started this almost 2 years ago, we were considered sort of a radical organization. And in that short time, I've really watched this ship turn. Suddenly it's not so radical anymore. In fact, our ideas, the things that we advocate for, that we've resolved to do, are happening. And that's because of you and all of those who've worked so hard around these issues. You know, our experts have done a great job of talking about what we'd like to see. And what we'd really like to see is a move from a model of cyclical dependency, which is what's been set up, to a model of self-sufficiency. And you know, this system that we have currently was really progressive 50 years ago. But with health changes, with changes in social policy, with changes in what we know about people with disabilities, this is an outdated system. And on a very personal level, this is my son. He's 3. And you know, we can't lose another generation to poverty and segregation. When we redrew our will, we had to write him out of the will so that he will not accumulate assets of over $2,000 in his lifetime. And he is capable. He just entered the system. He's had his first IEP. It was the most horrific experience of my life. And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. So, you know, what Madeline and Alan and Susan and everybody in the room have done so that my son can live a better life, we need to do for the next generation. And he's 3, so we have 18 years. But I hope it doesn't take that long. So I also just want to reiterate thank you to Scott Mulvaney and Congressman Harper's office. Congressman Harper introduced the team legislation, introduced the repeal of 14C legislation, and Neil Lewis is here from the National Federation of the Blind. Thank you. You know, these are not politically popular issues, and it really takes someone who has tremendous courage as a legislator to be able to do this. Also want to thank Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rogers' office and the Republican Conference for recording this today, making it available. We'll make it available for everyone. And just want to thank everybody for being here. This has been a tremendous event, and I hope that it will be the first of many. Thank you very much.